We are living way beyond our means.
Welcome to Irish history. Let's begin. The first arrival of the Romani Gipsies in Ireland was in the early 16th century. In 1541, it's recorded by Henry VIII, safe conduct for 40 days for John Nunn and his company. Egyptians, driven from Scotland by stress of weather. Egyptians was a term used to call the Romanis because it was believed they were wandering pilgrims from Egypt to Western Europe in the 16th century. Even though the Romani Gypsies left Scotland, actually on the pain of death, the Romani didn't seem to stay permanently in Ireland in 1541, because the next appearance of the Romani Gypsies was in the 19th century. A family of gypsies disembarked off a steamship in Queenstown, now Cove, in County Cork, in 1866. The steamship was bound to the United States, but it stopped at Queenstown for repairs. So the family went to the outskirts of Queenstown to set up tents for their campsite. And the reason for leaving England because of the prejudice which is gradually rising against them, making nomadism difficult for the family, and they had no choice but to leave England. But what they experienced in England, they also experienced in Cork. A large crowd gathered to drive the gypsies from creating a campsite. It was reported the locals hunted the families a couple of miles around the countryside so they wouldn't be able to camp anywhere. Eventually, the families were forced to head back to Queenstown, and they slept on the streets until the steamship was repaired and continued its journey. The first appearance of gypsy caravans was in Belfast 1868 by a group of families called the original Norwood and Epping Forest Gypsies, and was described as causing a great attraction in the city. Also recorded, the camp had 3 caravans and a number of tents. The same families moved to Dublin and camped at the Rotunda Gardens and opened their camp to the public and charged an admission fee of sixpence. The use of caravans for accommodation was in the early 1840s. Caravans, or living vans, are large transport wagons and were used for transport and living space. Also, it was pulled by a team of horses in France in the 1810s by a non-Romani circus group. But by the mid-1810s, it became smaller and pulled by one horse. In the middle of the 1840s, caravans were used in Britain by the Romani and added their own characteristic style of decoration. Back at the Epping Forest Gypsies, many of them were musicians, and since they allowed the public to come to the campsite and pay a fee, the gypsies would put on a show for dancing, engage in fortune telling, and sell handmade widow-work products. George Smith, who was the man behind the idea of charging the public the fee and putting on a show, because when the Romani gypsies were arriving in English towns, the public were coming to their campsite and looking around even while the Romanis were having a meal. When this gypsy family arrived in Belfast, it was a commercial operation with an element of carnival attached. The Eben family came back to Ireland in March 1870, visiting Cork and Limerick. Reported in the Freeman's Journal of the arrival of the family in September 1868 in Dublin, titled The Gypsies in Ireland, and stated that we now have a veritable gypsy encampment in Ireland, the first according to certain statements that ever visited this kingdom. The writer was questioning the veracity in the claim and drew a comparison between the life of Romani and travellers, and the article ponders the gypsies being in Ireland in an earlier era. The writer also states examination of the habits and manners of the Tingles travelling around Ireland as tinsmiths and horse dealers. Also a suggestion that the race had, in common with more objectionable ones, made a settlement in our midst. They took kindly to the soil and learned the use of the blackboard, adopting also the native patios. Indeed, they became what the English call more Irish than the Irish. This comparison between the travellers and Romani suggests the Irish travellers were living in campsites for many years before the arrival of the Gypsies. Back to George Smith, even though he is part of the Ebbing Forest group, he did his own travelling around Ireland frequently as a horse dealer and had children born in Ireland. Other Romani families came to Ireland for economic opportunities, and by the late 1860s, Romani hawkers and horse dealers in a small or single family with horse-drawn caravans became an often presence in Ireland. Hawkers are people who try to sell their wares, like at markets or go door to door. The names of gypsy families recorded at the time are Smiths, Lees, Palmers, and Reynolds. In 1874, a court case was taken by William Smith and his mother Eliza against Robert Talbot, a draper from Westport, County Mayo. The court record on the previous November, Talbot obtained a court order for the county sheriff to seize the Smiths' property, a camping site at the Temple Road, Blackrock County, Dublin, because of a debt. John Lee, an in-law to William Smith, owed Robert Talbot the sum of £40. Lee bought blankets to sell as a hawker. Now, the court record does mention the Smiths themselves did stay at Westport at the time Lee and his family were there too, and Lee and William's sister married some time previously. But also Lee failed as a horse dealer. But when the Smiths left Westport to go to Dublin, after a while the Lees left Westport too. And when the Lees arrived at the same site as the Smiths allowed them to stay, but the Lees had no property at the Smiths' campsite. William and Eliza argued the transaction between Lee and Talbot had no connection to the Smiths, and there was no liability on them. The jury held in favor of the Smiths, and the court ordered the return of the Smiths' property. But in July 1876, whether it was the same John Lee or a different John Lee, an incident in Portadown, County Armagh, 5 men severely beaten up John Lee at his camp, because Lee's horse apparently tore one of the men's coats earlier in the day at a water pump, and the man exchanged words and looked for Lee with 4 other men. The 5 men were convicted and fined. In 1897, a terrible incident happened in Cork, involving a first caravan fatal accident. A Welsh Romani called William Gentle and his family came to Ireland around 1890, but in a campsite near Kinsale, 12 March 1897, A strong wind overturned a caravan and crushed a teenage girl called Charlotte Jones, a niece of William Gentle. She didn't survive. Also in 1897, William Gentle extended Gentle family camp at Rathkill, County Limerick. In the 20th century, Romanis had established roots and stopping places around Ireland. The names of the Romanis travelling around Ireland were the Gentles, Webbs, Smiths, Lees, Wilsons, Boswells, Brazils, and many others. And most of the families are in the 1901 and 1911 consensus as occupation gypsies wagon. It's widely accepted travelers did not use horse-drawn wagons as living accommodation until the mid-1910s. Just as the Romani adopted the wagon from circus folk, travelers did the same from the Romani by traveling with them during the Great War. Irish travelers opted for the canvas-covered boat-top wagon rather than the square-sided Reading or burden caravan the Romani favored. Many of the Romani campsites during the winter time were in urban areas. One of the better campsites in Dublin was Dolphin's Barn Bridge, but in March 1915, two Romani girls lost their lives, Eileen and Kathleen Riley. The Bender tent they were living in caught fire. In the 1930s and 40s, a significant number of Romani families in Dublin were recorded in the Irish Press and Irish Times. In 1936, the Irish Press reported a number of Romani families in Gardiner Street with 9 caravans at the campsite. The Irish Times reported in 1945 they met and identified the number of Romani families and campsites. Taylors, Bolins, Scotts in Daly's in Gardiner Street, O'Neill's Dorset Street, Webb's Thomas Street, Riley and Sturgeon in Howard's Cross. It was mentioned the Taylors were living at Gardiner Street for more than 14 years. The stopping places in Dublin and other parts of the country have been forgotten because they migrated to Britain in the 1950s and 60s, as did the Irish travellers. Some Romani married into non-Romani families in Dublin and other parts of the country and became assimilated in these neighbourhoods. But still, a number of these families remain in Ireland, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic. And that is all for now. Slán.